My name is Ben. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're here for the first time or for the first time in a long time, then we want to say you're really welcome. And we want to help you to get to know our God and King Jesus if you don't know him already. I'm going to spend some time talking from the Bible. And we've been in a little series of talks as a church in the book of Ezra. Ezra is part of the Bible. It's part of the Old Testament. It's the story of God's people rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem after it had been destroyed by another empire, the Babylonians, and after God's people had been taken captive for 70 years. And that might all feel like a long, long way from your life in the Rhondda in the 21st century, but we've been using this book to think about how we build God's church. If you're here for the first time, maybe you're not yet a follower of Jesus, then I hope you'll track with us. What we want you to know more than anything is that Jesus is Lord and he forgives you of your sins. But today I'm going to be thinking mainly about how we build God's church together. In the first chapter of Ezra, we talked about how God stirs up his people to build his kingdom. And we looked at the story of Cyrus of Persia and how that happened. In Ezra chapter 2, we looked at the fact that God uses people and people who give pounds money in order to achieve his purposes. And we celebrated the contribution of all sorts of different people who have made the last 10 years of Hope Church life possible. And then in Ezra chapter 3, was that last week? Can't remember. 2 weeks ago? Sometime recently, we looked at some of the things that we can do together as a church to build in a way that God will bless. Building with unity, building with open Bibles, building on the priorities of proclaiming Jesus and worshiping God, building with courage, building with leadership, and building with thankfulness. That was Ezra chapter 3. And so today, we're in Ezra chapter 4. And Ezra chapter 4 is where everything starts to go wrong. And maybe you're thinking, well, if God told these guys to build the temple, and if God brought all these people and all this money together to build the temple, and if they started setting off in the right direction, doing all the right things in all the right ways, then surely it's going to be easy, right? Sometimes in the Christian life we can think like that, can't we? If God is for me, if God is with me, if God is blessing me, then surely there's going to be no trouble along the way. Ezra chapter 4 reminds us that even when we're walking in God's plans, even when we're doing things for God, it can still be really hard. I remember I made the mistake just a few weeks back of saying to somebody, when you're doing things God's way, in his timing, it's always really easy. And I've been reflecting on that in the last couple of weeks and realized, no, when you're doing things God's way, in his timing, even when he's spoken to you with clear direction, it can still be really, really hard, right? Some of us know that from our lives as Christians. We've said yes to Jesus, we're walking with him through our lives, and even though we're doing that, it's still really tough. I wonder if you said to Jesus, hey, you're the blessed one. You're the Son of God. The favor of heaven is on your life. Well, you must have an easy ride, right? What would Jesus say? He said, no, I'm going to a cross, right? Just because we're following God and walking in his blessings, it doesn't mean we get an easy ride. And in chapter 4, what we see is that the building work of this great building project of the temple grinds to a halt. The altar has been built. The foundations have been laid. Everything starts off really well. We read that in Ezra chapter 4. And yet, in Ezra chapter 3, and yet in Ezra chapter 4, verse 24, the work of the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Nobody knows when the second reign of Darius, king of Persia, was, do they? 15 years after they started building, for 15 years they stopped. They did nothing until the second year of Darius. That gives me quite a lot of hope for Hope Church, that we've gone through seasons, haven't we, where everything seems to be going well, where the church is growing, where the church feels buoyant and exciting, where it's like God is at work. And then we've also gone through seasons where things are really hard, where the church is maybe not growing or even going backwards, where there's frustrations and difficulties and everything else. Maybe your Christian life feels a little bit like that. Sometimes it's going forwards and sometimes it's going backwards. Sometimes we can be tempted in those difficult seasons to think, well, if God was in it, it wouldn't be so hard, right? We can think that in church life and in our personal lives. It wouldn't be so hard. It wouldn't be so slow. It wouldn't feel like everything's against us. Ezra chapter 4, and we're going to look at it in a bit of detail, reminds us that when it comes to the Christian life and when it comes to building God's kingdom and building his church, that even when it's slow and even when progress sometimes isn't existent, it doesn't mean for a minute that God's not at work. Make sense? So this is where we're going to go. Ezra chapter 4. And it's a bit of a confusing chapter. If you've got a Bible, you'll notice this. We're going to read about the opposition to the building of the temple. We're going to discover that it's not just a building project, it's also a battle. And what happens in this chapter, which is a bit confusing, is that for 5 verses, we read about the opposition that they face as they build. And then from verse 6 to verse 23, Ezra starts writing about another season of opposition that God's people have about 50 years later. Remember, he's recording, it's history, it's a history book. So he writes about the temple, and then he gets distracted and writes about some other stuff to emphasize how difficult extending God's kingdom can be. And then in chapters 5 and 6 and 7, he comes back to the theme of the temple. Does that make sense? I got confused by it when I was studying this week. So you can almost just, for the purpose of today, just ignore Ezra chapter 4, verse 6 to 23. We're going to focus on the first part. We're going to see that there is opposition to the building of the temple. In fact, what we're going to do, we're going to read from chapter 3, verse 12. It might come up. Fab. Opposition, here we go. Do you remember where we ended last time, by the way? When was it? Was it last week? 2 weeks ago? Remember how good everything was going? And they'd laid the foundations of the temple, and they'd put on their Sunday best, their suits and their frocks, and they'd polished up their trumpets, and they were having a great big celebration because the temple, the foundation of the temple had been built. Do you remember that? Well, then look what happens. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, whilst many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away. Prashant, we'll just keep going. We'll read through chapter 4. It's a couple of slides later, I think. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Syria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrated their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. The building project starts so well. They start making progress. They lay the foundation of the temple, and then everything starts to get difficult. And did you see there's opposition that comes from two camps? The first opposition comes from within God's people. See that? At the end of chapter 3, there were people that started to complain. Remember, this chapter starts with unity. They all gathered as one at the start of chapter 3. By the end of chapter 3, they were living in disunity. Let that be a warning to us, right, in this season. That just because we're unified now, we've got to fight to stay unified as a church. And it's worth us noting some things here about these guys and what happened. First of all, who gets upset? The older generation. The people who've been around for some time. What was their problem? They got disappointed. Whoa. Sorry. Was it that one that went? They'd got disappointed. Many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple. They were disappointed with this new generation and what they were building. Why were they disappointed? Because the temple did not meet their expectations from the past, right? They had this idea of what this temple should be like. They were looking through the rear view mirror at what God had done in a previous generation, a previous time, rather than looking forward in faith. They carried these expectations that eventually created disappointment, and that disappointment led to disunity. I want to say this is a very real danger for us. We're about to, if you don't know, transition from being one church in one place to having a church in Trebanog and hopefully a church up in Treorchy too. There's a very real danger that those of us that have been around here for some time, carry a whole bunch of expectations with us about what church is like into this new season. And at some point in the future, we look over our shoulders and we look at what God's done in Trebanog or is doing in Treorchy, and it's not quite what we want it to be because it's not quite like what we came from, right? Let's just note that danger. Some of us have come from different churches. This is a new season. We are trying to pursue what God is asking of us in this season. Let's be careful that we don't come with expectations that actually leads to disappointment, and disappointment that creates discontentment can ultimately lead to disharmony. How do we stop that from happening? Number one, let's look forwards, not backwards. Actually, I was in a meeting in, where was I? Somewhere in mid-Wales, near Aberystwyth, a couple of months back. And somebody who'd never met me, who didn't know me, didn't know the story of our church, said to me, I feel like God is telling me to tell you that you've got this, it's like you're driving in a car. You've got this tiny little broken rear view mirror. And you're spending all your time looking in the crummy rear view mirror about what happened in the past when God just wants you to look forwards and enjoy the journey. That can be a danger for us, can't it, in the Christian life? It can be a danger for us in this season. Let's look forwards, not look back. Number two, let's think the best of one another, our motives and each other's opinions. We don't want to end up disunified like these guys did, right? Number three, let's trust our leaders to lead. Let's celebrate what God is doing. We talked about that last time, rather than what he's not. Let's remember it's all about Jesus and not our individual preferences. And if we really do feel uncomfortable about how things are shaping up, like they did feel uncomfortable in chapter 3, then let's talk about it in loving conversation. It's much better to be open and talk openly than it is to complain privately. It's much better to talk to people than it is to criticize them behind their back. There is nothing that Satan would want more in this season of church as we try and multiply into many places than to just like a few little seeds of disharmony, right? A few little seeds of discontentment. You know, they start off small, but they soon grow big. They could destroy a church, particularly in a season of advance. That's the opposition that comes from within at the end of chapter 3. But that's not the only opposition to the building project. When we get to the start of Ezra chapter 4, we then also see the opposition that comes from the enemies of God's people. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and started being a nuisance. Now, how do we interpret this as a church in Tonopandi in the 21st century? It might be a bit weird. We're not like a nation surrounded by enemies that want to destroy our temple or whatever. The Bible says that the enemy of Christians is not other people or ungodly people or the people that live in our valley. The Bible says that we have one enemy. His name's Satan. He's out to kill and steal and destroy from our Christian lives and from the building of the church. And I think there's a few little things that are going on in chapter 4 which point us to the kind of ways that Satan is going to want to disrupt the journey of our church in this season. The first thing that happens is that the danger of diluting God's work. Did you see that? These enemies, verse 2, come to Zerubbabel, he's the leader of this building project, and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of some bloke, some king of Assyria, who brought us here." Sounds like a kind of a good deal, doesn't it? Some guys show up and they're like, "Let us give you a hand," except that Ezra has recorded that these were the enemies of God's people. They were out to interfere. They were out to cause a nuisance. They were going to compromise the holiness of this building project. And in the same way, Satan wants to dilute what we're doing and cause us to compromise what we're trying to do. He wants us to dilute our holiness, to dilute our commitment, to dilute our vision. And for these guys, it was about letting other nations come in and build with them. But for us, it doesn't quite look the same. I want you to know this as well. Satan is our great enemy, but Satan works through other people, right? He works through people. There might be some people that show up in Trebanog or Tonopandi or Treorchy in this next season that aren't out to do us good. We've seen that in the journey of Hope Church a number of times where people have shown up. Maybe their intentions look pretty good, like in Ezra chapter 4. "Hey, let us give you a hand." And then you soon discover that they aren't building for the glory of Jesus. They're trying to distract us. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, you like in Trebanog now in January, Becky's on the door. Somebody new turns up. Give them a suspicious stare. What are you here for? Are you good? You going to help us? We don't do that, right? It's not about creating suspicion. But I do want to say, let's be discerning that not everybody who shows up in church and says, "Let us build," is here for our good, right? That's one of Satan's schemes. Now, that doesn't work in the story. Thankfully, Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the heads of the family of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us to do." They say, "We're all right. We're just going to get on with it. God's given us a task to do." And so the enemies change their tactic. Look what comes next. Verse 4, discouragement. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah. This is massive. One of the ways that Satan will try and slow us down in the Christian life and in what we're trying to do in terms of starting these new churches is he's going to try and discourage us. And discouragement comes when you see the things that aren't happening to be bigger than they are, and you see the things that God is doing to be much smaller than they are. Does that make sense? This is I want to tell you that this is going to happen in the next few months in Trebanog and Tonopandi and Treorchy. When the guys are up in Trebanog and it's week 3, in the middle of end of January, start of February, and there's a blowing a gale on the top of Trebanog, like only in Trebanog it can, right? And they've put all their effort in on a Sunday morning to get up, get the kids out the house, to get there to set up, and then nobody shows up, and it's just 8 or 9 of them kicking around in the building. What's Satan going to do? What are you doing? Why are you bothering? It's not amounting to anything. Discouragement, right? Same in Tonopandi, when some people have left to go to Trebanog and Treorchy, and there's less of us here, and on some Sundays it feels a little bit flat, or that person that you invited to come to church, and they said they were coming, and you're waiting at the door, and you're hoping that they come, and 4 o'clock comes past, and 4:05 comes past, and are they going to show up? And no, they don't. You text them that night, they ignore you. Why did I bother? Wasn't worth the hassle, right? Discouragement. And then it carries on. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and also to make them afraid to go on building. After discouragement comes intimidation. You know, in this season, as we go from one thing to 3 things, Satan would love to discourage us. He'd also love to make us feel afraid. I said it last week, didn't I? You saw that in chapter 3. They built despite their fears. I love that. Even when you're building despite your fears, you know what Satan's going to do? Keep on reminding you of what you're fearful of. Right? This happens in our lives as Christians all the time. There's some legitimate fears that we have, but Satan wants to stir them up. He wants to put our focus on our fears, not on our God. And, you know, it's interesting to me that these things come all at the same time. I don't know whether you've ever had that. We had a day like that on Friday where just like when all of the stuff kicks off at the same time just to try and smash you down, right? Some of us have experienced that in the Christian life. Certainly we've had moments where you experience it as a church. You know, when the distractions and the disappointments and the fears and everything, you know, when it all comes at the same time, that's normally a good indication that it's Satan that's doing it. Be on your guard. Where did we get to? We had diluting, discouragements, fear, and then after the fear, verse 5, they bribed, and so that the discouragement wasn't working, the fear wasn't working, and so they bribed officials to work against them and to frustrate their plans. I found this so helpful. You know that when we're planting these churches here in Treorchy and up there, you know that Satan is out to frustrate our plans. You know when, like, you plan your Sunday and you've got all your people on your rotas and you've sorted it all out and you've got great, the time of worship rehearsal is great, and the preacher comes with a great message and the tech's all working and everything's going well, and then all of a sudden 4 o'clock hits and it's like everything falls to pieces. This morning I was preaching in the church, somebody pressed the wrong button, and all of a sudden there was like rave lighting going on in the middle of the worship time, and it was like, what on earth is going on now? I remember the very first meeting we had for Hope Church up in the chapel up the road. We had 200 people turn up for the first meeting. It was like a celebration thing. All our mates came from Cardiff and wherever. And, you know, we sung Come Rhondda, and we shouted about Jesus, and it was putting a stake in the ground. We're going to plant this church and whatever. I think the meeting was 4 o'clock. I might be wrong. Literally at 3:59, the projection system stopped working. I'm like, oh, Lord, what is going on? And I'm the only person in the room who knows, like, where all the wires go and how it's all set up. And it was up on a balcony, and I was down the front, and it just went like that. I'm like, please. Do you know what the problem was? The fuse blew in the plug to the kettle lead that went into the projector. When was the last time a fuse blew in a plug in your house? Doesn't happen, right? But Satan wants to frustrate our plans. Eventually, in verse 24 of chapter 4, the work of the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill. You know, it's verse 23, sorry. They intimidated the Jews in Jerusalem and ultimately compelled them by forcing them to stop. Eventually, these guys were forced into stopping. Satan would like nothing else than to stop us building his church in the Rhondda. And here's what I want you to see, Hope Church, in this season. We're not just in a building project. We're also in a battle, right? Me and Di Meads were off on the road. I was preaching somewhere this morning. And Di was just saying, there is a spiritual battle going on in the Rhondda right now. You know that? That Satan is trying to do everything he can to keep people in darkness. It's a battle. You know, in the story, there's a story that comes after the rebuilding of the temple. It's the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah leads the way. They rebuild the walls. Is it 54 or 56 days? But you know how they have to build? They've got their trowels in one hand, and they've got their swords in the other. Right? Because it's a building project, but it's also a battle. And the enemy, Satan, wants to cause as much discouragement, disunity, disappointment, disruption, dilution, and delay as he possibly can when it comes to building his church. You know, the same is true in the Christian life, right? It's a battle. It's a battle. There's an enemy of our souls who's out to discourage us, to take our eyes off Jesus, to disrupt our plans, to frustrate us and disappoint us and cause disunity amongst us. Watch out in this season for the schemes of Satan. It can feel a little bit terrifying, can't it? So what's the remedy? Well, here's what I love in this story. At the end of chapter 4, everything grinds to a halt for 15 years. And then at the start of chapter 5, we're told about some people who God spoke through. Now, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Iddo, or Iddo, if you're Welsh, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Now, here's what's cool. Everything stops. So God stirs up two guys to speak to the people, to encourage them to get going again. And we have these prophecies written in our Bibles. And I want us just to flick to the book of Haggai. It's actually, I'm going to tell you now, probably the hardest book in the Bible to find because it's literally one page. It's stuck between Zephaniah and Zechariah, if that helps you at all. I've got to try and find it now whilst you're all watching me. Here we go. I want to give you 3 highlights from the book of Haggai that God speaks to his people to encourage them and to challenge them to keep going, even though it's flipping hard work to build God's church. First one is this. God challenges them to not get distracted. This is the word of the Lord that came through Haggai the prophet in Haggai 1 verse 3. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses whilst the house of the Lord remains in ruin? Here's what happens. They stopped building the temple, so for 15 years they built their houses instead. I bet they had some pretty plush houses after 15 years, right? Do you know there's something going on here? You know when you get disappointed or hurt in church? You know when it just gets hard and frustrating and difficult? You know one of the things that Satan tempts us to do? Just get distracted by all of your other stuff. Just like, I'm not going to do all that anymore. I'm just going to look after me and my house. That's what's going on right here. We all feel that sometimes, don't we? I can tell you there have been many times in the Franks household where church has just got too tough. And Lois has said to me, or I've said to Lois, why don't we just look after ourselves? Why don't we just be a happy family and not worry about church and have some jobs, make some money, go on 2 nice holidays a year, and it'll just be really nice. That's a temptation, right? The God speaks through Haggai and says, you can't just dwell in your wood-paneled houses whilst the temple of the Lord lies in ruin. We've just spent 5 years doing a building project that we didn't ask for in Ynyswen. It's been an absolute nightmare. But now we've got quite a nice house. It's not quite wood-paneled, it's plasterboard paneled. But even so, do you know the verse that's been ringing in my ears since the day we moved into that house? You can't just dwell in your wood-paneled house, Ben, when the temple of the Lord in Treorchy lies in ruins, right? Let's not get distracted. God has put us here for a reason. And then you go, yeah, but the thing is, God, it's flipping hard work and disappointing and frustrating, and there's disunity and disharmony, and there's dilution and all the rest of it going on. Lord, I don't know whether we can keep doing it. The second thing that Haggai the prophet says, I've lost my notes, where am I? Is this, chapter 1, verse 13. Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 5, he says something similar again. This is what I have covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. Friends, when life gets tough, when enemies' schemes come, when planting churches in Trebanog and Treorchy and redoing this thing when some of us have left, when that all gets tough, God wants us to know that he's still with us and that his spirit remains upon us, right? Get that in your psyche. God has not left us. He doesn't forsake his people. If you're going through a tough time right now, God has not left you. He will not forsake you. You are his beloved child. God wants to encourage us that he's with us when things get tough. And then also he wants to encourage us with this. Chapter 2, verse 7. Where is it? This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come. And I will. You could highlight that. I will fill my house with glory. Friends, when things get tough, remember that verse. Remember the promise of God. He will. He will fill his house with glory. He will, right? When we're doing stuff up in Trebanog and we're doing stuff in Treorchy and we're doing stuff here, when you have a bad Sunday or when somebody leaves the church or when somebody is anti the church in the communities that we're working in, be assured of this, that God has promised. He says this, Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You know, there's been so many moments in the last 10 years where Lois and I have just had to plant our feet on that promise again and say, no, he's promised. He's promised that he will use this to bring himself glory. And here's the wonderful thing with what happens in the book of Ezra. If I can flick back there. Sorry, we're all over the place here. They start to build. All the hardship comes. They put down their tools for 15 years. Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet speak, hey, don't get distracted and comfortable with your little lives. Hey, I'm with you and I want to use you and I will build my church and it will be full of glory. And so they start to build again. And here's the thing, what I love about this story, that God makes a way for this temple to be complete. You'd think maybe they had their little season of like hardship and then, they got through their test and then it was just like floating on cloud number 9. They're like throwing bricks on the wall and they're just landing in the perfect spot, you know. The roofers don't have to hammer with any force. They don't have a sore shoulder by the end of the day and everything's just glorious and the temple basically builds itself. You might think that's the story. For one verse they build and then the opposition comes again. A bloke called Tetaniah, who's the governor of the Trans-Euphrates. Basically, he's like the boss of this whole area, looking after it on behalf of the Persian king. He comes, and in verse 3, he says this, "Oh, who authorized you to build this temple and to finish it?" He's like, "What you doing?" And he actually feels a bit like school. You ever remember when the school teacher would be like, something's going on in the playground, and a teacher would come along with their notebook and be like, right, boys, I want your names. Write them all down. That's what he does. He says, "Give me your names. I'm going to take your names. I'm going to take them back to King Darius over in Persia and tell him that you've been naughty boys." That's what's going on. The start of chapter 5. And I love what happens. I love that God makes a way. Have a look. Verse 3. At that time, Tetaniah, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, lovely name, and their associates went to them and asked, "Who authorized you to build this temple and to finish it?" They also asked, "What are the names of those who are constructing this building?" But, I love this, the eye of their God was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped. This is how the story goes. Tetaniah goes off to Darius, king of Persia, who's the big cheese in the whole of the world at this time. And he says, these guys are building a temple down in Jerusalem. Like, who told them that they could do that? You know, he's expecting Darius to go, "They shouldn't be doing that. Out with them," or something like that. It's like I have not done this. Anyone here ever built something without planning permission and then got caught for it? That's what's going on right here in this chapter. And these are guys who, they've already had their temple ransacked. They've already been carried away as prisoners to a foreign land. They're probably bricking it in this moment. Tataniah's turned up. All of our efforts, all of our hard work, it's going to be wasted because he's going to flatten our temple. And Darius goes, "Oh, you've got to read chapter 5. It's a bit comical, really. It'd be a good play." He's like, "Let's go and look in the National Library to see if we can find any history about why these guys are doing this." They go to the treasury. They find a scroll. And on it says that Cyrus, the old king of Persia, told them to do it. And Darius goes to Tetaniah and he says, "We found a scroll, and so I decree, let these guys get on with their work, give them all the money and resources that they need." And then he says, "And by the way, Tetaniah, you're going to oversee the work and make sure that it happens." That's the story. I'm not making it up. It's in the Bible, I promise. Chapter 5 of Ezra. And then, chapter 6, that is, sorry. And then this happens, verse 13. Then because of the decree of King Darius that King Darius had sent, Tetaniah, the governor of the Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. How good is that? Maybe you don't like Persian history, I don't know. But 19 years it took. God stirred their hearts. They came back from a foreign land in order to build this temple for the glory of the living God. They started and then they stopped. It got too hard. For 15 years, they did nothing other than look after their houses. But God said, "You know, do it. Work for me. I'm going to be with you. I will build my house. I will fill it with glory." And then Tetaniah shows up and tries to slam the whole thing again. But God's eye was on his people. He makes a way for this temple to be built. I want you to know that God is watching over us, that he is with us, and that he is for us in this season. God makes a way. What man meant for evil in this story, Tetaniah, God works for good. You might be here, you're a Christian, and your Christian life feels a bit like the building project of the temple. Just like it's just not easy. Like there's moments where I feel stirred by God. There's moments where I feel like I'm building and going forwards and I can see progress. And then most of the time I just feel like I'm standing still. Most of the time it feels like Satan is out to get me. Even when I start going forward, it feels like I take one step forwards and then 2 steps backwards. Anybody feel like that's the Christian life? God is making a way. He will bring to completion what He started in your lives. You know, this story also sounds a lot like church planting. We've been here for 10 years now. Some of us have been here for quite a while. The story of the temple feels much like the story of Hope Church. There's been stirrings. There's been moments. There's been some progress. There's been some good things. But you know, there's also been seasons where it's just like Satan is marching all over this thing. You shake off one season of difficulty and frustration and disappointment. You step forward and then all of a sudden a tetaniah shows up and you feel like you're on the back foot again. This is what it's going to be like for us. It's what it's going to be like in Trebanog. Don't tell me I've got no faith. I want it to work, but it's not going to be just like, the Christian life has never been for anybody just an upward trajectory into glory, right? It's flipping hard work because there's an enemy of our souls. You know, this story sounds a lot like the story of our Treorchy congregation. We started, we stopped, we're hoping to start again. We've been through seasons of, in fact, some of you don't know about it. Just before COVID, 6 months before COVID, we started this congregation up in Treorchy. It sounded like a good idea at the time. We thought we were going to change the world. Bought a house, found out it was falling down. Started the church, COVID hit. Tried to keep the church going, kept coming back after COVID, we lost our venue. Then people fell out with us. They didn't like how we were leading the church. And all of a sudden, this thing got smaller and smaller and more difficult. We ended up meeting here, because we had nowhere to meet up there, with about 8 people, till one day we looked each other in the eyes and said, we just can't keep doing this how we're doing it right now. And for the last 3 years, we've been in that Ezra chapter 4 state. We put down our tools. We'd be back here trying to regroup and rebuild. But you know, Ezra and the book of Haggai have really been helping us. We've been studying Haggai in our Hope community up in Treorchy and hearing what God might want to say to us to help us to prepare for rebuilding. I want to end by inviting some people up from our Treorchy congregation. These are some of the people who were here before COVID when we started. The truth is there's not many of us left. But I want to ask Lowry and Steve and Di to come up. And I just want them to tell you something of what we've experienced. The good, the bad, and where God has us now. So guys, why don't you come up here? Steve, Lowry, Di. I'm trying to look around the room to see who else there is. Firstly, I want to honor these guys because we've been through, to say hell and high water wouldn't be quite right. It's been a blinking painful journey trying to do Treorchy. And these guys have stuck with us, as has Jenna in the back. Engine and Han aren't here. But these guys have journeyed through what's been a remarkably difficult season for us. And so I want to say thank you to you guys. But Lowry, you're going to tell us a little bit about the high points of Treorchy Church and what was going on before COVID and, what was God was doing then.
Okay. So we started, I came in Alpha, and it was really good. Jenna as well. We also found out we were cousins in this church, which is also a bit mad, but very RCT. But anyway, so we were just doing Alpha, and it was just so full. It was weird, and then it was a small church, but God was really moving. I feel we saw loads of people come to faith there, including myself and my sister. And it was just good. It was quite small, but it was really powerful, and I felt God was really speaking. And we just saw loads of new people coming through the door all the time, which I obviously thought was normal considering that was my first church. But I've come to realise that doesn't happen in a lot of places. So it was just a really special place and a really special time.
So we used to meet in Oak Tree Hall on Cemetery Road, this little old community hall. And yeah, Laurie mentioned Alpha. There was one evening on a Wednesday night where Lois went into the spa to buy some milk on the way home. And a person in there said to Lois, she said, "What is going on in Oak Tree Hall? Because people keep coming out of that place saying that their lives are being transformed." It was such a sweet season in the life of the church. God was at work. So Steve, COVID hit. Just explain a little bit of the chaos that we ended up in and how that left us feeling as a group.
Yeah, just to go back to that Alpha course that Laurie briefly mentioned, we've done a few Alpha courses over the years, and there was something very, very special about that particular Alpha course. And we were there, we said we were going to do it, and then every day leading up to it, the enemy is whispering, nobody's going to come. And thankfully, loads of people, like Laurie said, loads of people did came, and Laurie and Jenna, got saved because of that, and, it was just brilliant. But we went from Alpha to meeting on a Sunday, which I loved because Oak Tree is literally 60 seconds from my house. So bring back Oak Tree. But yeah, we was cruising, if we could put a word to it. We was accelerating, wasn't we? We had a fair-sized congregation, and everything was good. COVID hit, and we went from meeting to not meeting to meeting online to eventually being back in this building, and everything just got very complicated and very confusing, wasn't it? With the rules changing every week and having to book online and all this kind of stuff. So we went from cruising nicely to, yeah.
We always thought that we would come out of that and that God would just open up a door again. We'd be back in Oak Tree, everybody would come back, and it would just carry on where we left off. Of course, it's not always how things work, right? And I remember a moment, we'd been doing Sunday mornings here. Do you remember the days of socially distanced, 15 people in the room, sign up at an Eventbrite, come with your mask over your face, you can't sing, and everybody's behind screens? Do you remember how awful that was? It was doubly awful when you wished that you were up in the top of the valley and you were down here. And I can remember a Sunday when it was me, Lois, Steve, Jenna, maybe Dom was around by then, and Engine and Han, and just looking at us and going this is not what we signed up for. We're going to have some moments like that maybe again in the future. So Dave, we've been back here for a few years. There's been a lot of people in my ear. When are we going to be back in Treorchy? When are we going to be back in Treorchy? When are we going to be? I don't know. Leave me alone. There's been some of that. But we've been on a journey as a group, haven't we? And we've spent the last few months thinking about what it might look like to relaunch Treorchy. And one of the things that has come to the fore for us is that through this season, God's been at work, and that what man meant for evil, or what Satan meant for evil, God is working for good. So just explain to us a little bit of how we've processed that and how you see things now as we're looking to go forward.
Thank you. I think at the time, we can't say God wasn't in it because God was in it, and it was really good and things were going forward. We've just been attacked in different ways. The venue, the people that run the venue, and then Treorchy's quite an hard area spiritually because you can't open anything there. People are you can open that, but if it's church, no, you're not bothering with that. And it's quite hard. But we've been meeting for Connect Group, and it's been growing and growing, and the people there just really want a church there, and I think the desire is there and the heart is there. And we meet on a Tuesday morning as well for a prayer. I'd love to do the prayers of people there because they just lay everything before God, and they really want not just the church in Treorchy, we want every area to know, because it isn't about us, it isn't about, we've got more people coming and we're growing big. It's about advancing God's kingdom and telling people and letting people know. And I think that's the art of everyone now. I think it's a stronger. Sometimes God strips things in the way, and you come through stronger and fitter. And it's like building a wall. The picture I have is, your stone wallings. You get stones, you put them in, and people are in place, and then that one don't fit, so it's for one side, but it's not lost. It's just for one side until it's time to put it in that wall. And I think with the church, it builds like that. Not everyone fits at that time, so they might go away, but they might come back, because God uses people at different times. So if you build a wall, all stones are different shapes, and they go in different places. And I think that's the sort of thing we're doing in Torquay, really, that people are fitting into place more. Yeah.
Thank you. Why don't you just one of these guys? Mine and Lois's testimony has simply been that it's been probably the hardest leadership challenge that we faced in the life of Hope Church, trying to figure out how to get through this. Many emotions, many disappointments, and quite a lot of unanswered questions. Why is God letting us go through this? And we've picked up some wounds along the way. We all do in the Christian life. But I think I'm convinced of this, that thing that I said, chapter 5, verse 5, but the eye of their God was watching over them. That's true of what we've been doing in Treorchy. God is watching over us. He knows the end from the beginning. But it's also true of our Christian lives. Whatever you're going through, however difficult it gets, God hasn't left your side. He's still watching over you. In light of our story, I'd love us just to end with this. For the guys that have stayed with us, I want you to know that your friendship and your encouragements and your resilience has been incredibly precious to Lois and I on what's been quite a confusing journey, and I'm really grateful for it. I want us all to know and to learn from this story as we head into this 3-congregation thing that we're going to try and do next year. Best case scenario, everything goes brilliantly from start to finish. We get 3 wonderful congregations, and everybody looks at it in 12 months' time and go, wow, look how great Ben Franks did now. Right? Worst case scenario, it's slow, it's hard. Maybe at times it's disillusioning. We don't get all the opportunities we hope for. Don't for a minute think that that doesn't mean that God's not in it. It took them 19 years to build the temple. We've only been here 10. Right? God can do an awful lot when people keep on persevering in the small, quiet places. Finally, I'd love us just to pray. I'd love to encourage you guys to pray for our Treorchy crew. Some of them are here, some of them aren't here today. But God is doing a beautiful little thing. It's not impressive, it's not fancy. We haven't got any superstars, but we've just got a group of people who love Jesus and love Treorchy and the Upper Rhondda. And we want to see something happen to the glory of Jesus. And we really need your prayers. Trebanog is like flashy superstar Christianity, right? Had a lot of exposure, had a whole bunch of great and new things going on. We've just spent 3 years plodding, trying to get through every single week. I just want to ask you, would you pray for us that God would take hold of what we're doing and make it into something wonderful? Because the guys in Treorchy need the gospel just as much as the guys in Trebanog or the people of Tonopandi. I've talked too much. I'm done. I'm going to hand it.